I'm Jasmine El-Gamal, and this is The View from Here. Today's view is from humanitarian surgeon Morgan McMonagle, who besides his work here in the UK, has volunteered in conflict zones like Ukraine and Gaza. For the last 22 months, Israel has been in a stated war against Hamas, following the attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. But almost immediately, we would see that this was no ordinary war. We heard Israeli government officials from the get-go say that there were no innocent people in Gaza. And that set the stage for what has become one of the most devastating rates of civilian casualties in modern history. Now, Israel and its supporters, including the US and the EU, will say that this is because Hamas has embedded itself in the population, that it uses schools and hospitals and refugee tents to hide amongst the civilian population, and that there's no way to avoid these kinds of civilian casualties. But is this really true? Has this really been unavoidable? Is it lawful to bomb an entire hospital because you're going after Hamas? Is it lawful to render the hospital completely unusable? Not just now, but in the future? And more importantly, or just as importantly, is it moral to do so? These hospitals are not just essential for immediate emergency care in the aftermath of strikes and shootings, but they offer vital services, including dialysis and cancer treatment, which have been made completely unavailable in Gaza since the destruction of the Turkish Friendship Hospital and the European Hospital. Childbirth has become a horrific and traumatic ordeal for many women, as preterm deliveries, stillbirths, and maternal deaths have surged, and strikes on maternity wards have shut off access to essential prenatal care. C-sections are being increasingly done without anesthetic, antiseptic supplies, or reliable power. Now, when you read statistics like that, it almost seems too much to comprehend. Like, what does this mean? What does it look like for people living it on the ground, for people who've seen it in close range? What's it like to work in a place where no person and nowhere is safe? What does it mean for people who do survive? What do their futures look like now? So to close out the conversation, I asked Morgan what message he had for policymakers who've either enabled or failed to prevent the death, injury, displacement, and starvation of Gaza's 2 million people. And his answer, I think, will move you. Morgan McMonagle, welcome to The View from Here.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thanks for having me.
I'm really happy. I know you're only in town for a day, so I'm really happy that you made time to come and sit down with us. I wanted to ask you first about your work. You're a trauma surgeon, trauma and vascular surgeon. What can you describe to us what that is exactly?
Yeah, it's kind of a rare breed because not many people are dual qualified in both areas. There's a handful in the UK. So I'm formally trained as a general and vascular surgeon, UK trained. I spent some time in Australia doing vascular surgery and trauma surgery. And then I went to North America and did a separate fellowship in Philadelphia, completely different to vascular, which was concentrating on trauma, which manages the most severely injured patients.
Well, I mean, that's obviously a very intense field. I mean, can you tell us what made you decide to become a trauma surgeon?
Yeah, good question. I think it attracts a certain type of character. You do need a certain type of grit. Where you get a certain buzz out of repairing something acutely, where you have to make big, bold decisions now, and you see the outcomes, because previously patients died, and the mortality in countries around the world before they had proper organised trauma centres was far higher than after they had proper organised trauma centres, which includes staffing them with trauma-trained people.
Yeah, well, I actually read about that. So the centre that you work in London, the Imperial Major Trauma Centre, that was created because up until 2010, and I was surprised to read this because it's fairly recent, 2010, that the UK had lower survival rates than most of Western Europe and the US. So this trauma center was created, as I understand it, to put together a holistic team of people that can work on all aspects of trauma.
Yeah, I think all healthcare systems are always evolving. They are a living, breathing thing on their own. And at the turn of the century, for sure, the outcomes for trauma would not have been as comparably good compared to, say, North America. And it was part of London and the UK in the wider sense to create a trauma network. And I think now the London trauma network as a whole is probably one of the largest networks in the world population-wise, and very proudly can hold its head up and say it's one of the better ones in the world now. And it has had a halo effect in that it has spread to Manchester and Birmingham and Sheffield and Leeds and up to Scotland as well. So really it's compared to 2 decades ago or even a decade ago, we're in a completely different place.
Yeah. And I'm going to share this in the notes for people listening, in the podcast notes, but there was a documentary actually made, I think it was a Channel 4 documentary that was made about your center. And
there was 2, certainly in my time, maybe even 3, following major trauma patients around the London Trauma Network. That's right. And they certainly spent some time at St. Mary's. I happened to be Surgeon of the Week when the Westminster Bridge attack happened. So that's right. March 2017, I want to say.
This was March 2017, this terrorist attack on Westminster.
I remember it very well because it was a boring day. There was nothing happening. It was a quiet day. And then suddenly we got a call to say there's been a terrorist attack. And like all mass casualty events, because that's in theory what it is, although you train for it and you prepare for it and you mentally prepare for it and you get ready as a team, nothing really prepares you for what you're about to see, the first 5 minutes of contact, and that's fine. That's to be expected. Everything then tends to settle down as people play their role. Yeah. And even though when it kicked off, there was a little bit of internal panic, not really external panic, but by the end of the day, one could certainly look back and say we did good. We performed very well, and although you do a lot of self-reflection after these sorts of incidences, and there's a lot of teamwork afterwards, and people look back. We always look, what could we have done better? That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means that, going back to my first comment, healthcare is always evolving. Always evolving. And what can you do better? And we honestly could hold our hands up and say we did very good. And the entire staff came together like a proper functioning London Symphony Orchestra. It was great. So
then after that, you started volunteering in conflict zones, right? So you were in Ukraine and you were in Gaza. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But I don't know if this is a silly question, but I mean, did you, having been through that kind of, severe trauma, terrorist attacks in London, did that prepare you at all for working in a conflict zone, or are those just two completely different things?
Yeah, no, it does. I'd spent some time doing pre-hospital care in Australia and did a little bit in the UK as well. I worked around Sydney doing helicopter work. So I was kind of used to working in an austere environment, going out and picking up injured patients, winching. Going to a conflict zone is something I had wanted to do for some time. And I'll name drop David Knott, one of my mentors, who's extremely experienced in that. So I followed in his footsteps to a certain degree, got a lot of advice from him, and I've spent time in West Bank. I've been to Lebanon, Ukraine, and Gaza at this stage.
So you were most recently in Gaza. Yeah. So March 2025.
February, March of this year, and I was there in February, March of 2024 as well. So it was my second trip going back.
Both in this, post-October 7th kind of situation that we're in. And obviously things have only gotten more and more devastating. And you were actually in Gaza on the night that Nasser Hospital, which is where you were working, which is now the largest functioning hospital in Khan Yunis in the south. You were there when it was bombed by Israeli forces. What was that like?
Well, I was in Rafah in 24 in a field hospital with a different NGO, and that was before the ground invasion of Rafah occurred. And it was just before Ramadan of 2024, and they pulled us out early because they were expecting a major ground invasion imminently. It didn't happen for I think 2 months, but either way, I saw the devastation that was happening in 2024, and that was just after January, February, when the number of injuries were massive and the populations were massively displaced from North Gaza down. So we were certainly extremely busy and saw a lot of child amputees, a lot of children having amputations done, a lot of shrapnel injuries, but they pulled us out early. I didn't want to go, but you got to do what security tells you. Going back in 2025, we arrived in February when there was a ceasefire, for want, of a better word. It was an official ceasefire. So there were some supplies getting in, some medical supplies, some food getting in. And then the ceasefire broke. It was breached. I think March 18th, that we were all awoken at about 1 in the morning, maybe 2 in the morning, with the sound of, the entire building was shaking. The bombs were that close. In fact, the door of the room we were sharing, there's 12 men in a room. So you can imagine the state of that room. The door actually flew open with the blast. And then you're quite right, on March 23rd, I think, was when the hospital itself was targeted. We were on the 4th floor. I was in the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. Myself and another volunteer from America, we were trying to decide between 2 patients who to bring back who was still bleeding. We had received one from a field hospital and they were both critically injured, and we needed to go back and do more surgery, and then the whole building shook. At first I thought it was a bomb that had just, had hit the surroundings of the building, the curtilage of the hospital. But I went and looked outside and I saw fire 2 floors below me. So it was the 2nd floor. And sure enough, the hospital was hit. It focuses the mind in a situation like that. Was I scared? No, but I had what you might describe as anticipatory anxiety, I suppose, because we still knew we had a job to do. The NGO we were with were excellent. The staff were excellent. They were more concerned about our safety.
Which one was that?
MAP,
Medical
Palestinians.
Aid for Palestinians.
Yeah.
I think not many people truly appreciate that point, that there is nowhere that is safe. Yeah. When we listen to people say, whether it's the Israeli government or people who are on TV who say, well, they were warned to move from point A to point B. They don't really understand that there is nowhere that is safe in Gaza. And so you're operating in this environment. I'm sure that some kind of surreal, you're not really sitting there thinking, oh, I could die, or this person, you're just in survival mode at the time, but also just, I need to operate. I need to save a life. I need to, describe, how does that feel to just be like, I'm literally being bombed right now. We are being bombed in this hospital. I have this number of patients, and the hospitals were overcrowded. They didn't have enough beds. You didn't have enough supplies. How do you spring into action in a moment like this? And how do you even decide where to start?
Wow, a lot of, I don't know, other than you stay focused on the moment. And maybe it's the ultimate mindfulness that you are completely focused on the moment, the here and now, which is what the Gazan population has been doing since the current conflict started. And it's not a war, it's a conflict. So, well,
just on that, the leading Israeli genocide and Holocaust historian just wrote an article in the New York Times saying, I know a genocide when I see it. And it hasn't been officially called a genocide yet, but we do have to also understand that it's also not just a conflict. Yep. Even though it hasn't been officially classified yet, I believe one day it will be classified officially as a genocide. But regardless of what people call it, conflict, genocide, war crimes, it is something we haven't seen before in our lifetimes.
Yeah, no, you're right. And what I meant was, when I said it's not a war, it's a conflict, meaning a war is a conflict between 2 sovereign nations.
Right, of course, yes.
Where the playing field is even. Yeah. It's not an even playing field. It's one sovereign nation in quotation marks that is attacking a civilian population. And that's what I believe, and that's what I saw, and that's me advocating for the truth. When the hospital was targeted and we stayed focused, you do go into a sort of survival mode by focusing on the moment, which is what the Gazan population has been doing every single day. So it was this tiny glimpse into that. And at first we didn't know whether or not the hospital was being targeted officially, as in they're now going to bomb the hospital completely, or whether there was another target. As it turned out, it was another target that happened to be in the hospital at that time. But nevertheless, you still shouldn't bomb healthcare facilities. After about 20 minutes, when we got told the situation was okay, that we do not believe there are that the hospital building is being targeted per se, we then took a patient back and we operated until about 3 or 4 in the morning. So we got on with things. And it was one of the things that our clinical psychologists warned us about, that when it comes to the regular Gazan population, they've been dealing with that every single day for, it's a year and a half now or more. They're all in survival mode. And it's only when things eventually will stop and they can reflect on just exactly what has happened to their lives and how much they've lost and the depth of what they've lost, then we might see the mental health issues coming out. But at the moment, everyone's in survival mode. And the night the hospital was bombed, it was a tiny glimpse for us into what they've been putting up with every single day.
Every single day, that's right. They haven't had time to process. They haven't had time to think about it. I actually just saw the documentary, Doctors Under Attack, that was supposed to be aired by the BBC, but then the BBC decided not to air it, citing impartiality issues. And I remember when I was watching that, it's exactly like you said, these doctors, these Palestinian doctors and the foreign doctors working with them. But the Palestinian doctors specifically, because of what you just said, they have been living this reality. They can't leave. They can't go back to their home countries, not to minimize from what you did at all and what foreign doctors do, but they can't leave. And, they're dying, they're being killed, they're losing colleagues. How did you feel working with your Palestinian colleagues, knowing that you could, you were going to leave at the end of your time there? They were there. Did that ever cause any tension, or guilt inside of you or were you you're just there to do the job, to help them as best as you could? And do you stay in touch with any of them still today?
I do. Look, when you share an experience, it's like any group, survivors of abuse or survivors of drug addiction or alcoholism. There's a certain shared experience that only people who have shared it or have experienced it will truly understand. So it doesn't matter, you have the best partner in the world, the best family in the world, the best siblings, friends, they'll never truly understand it. So that's a bond that you certainly develop with the Palestinian healthcare workers, nurses and doctors when you're there. They were more concerned about our safety when the hospital was bombed. We were due to leave the next day. We were due to exit and we couldn't. We were kept back for another 2 weeks. And they couldn't have felt more guilty. They felt guilty that we were stuck. And they
felt guilty that you were stuck.
They kept apologizing, we're so sorry. And I was like, man, it's not you didn't do this. So my overwhelming feelings were anger and guilt. I have to say, I don't really recall feeling very scared, but anger and guilt. And the anger coming from seeing the destruction of people's lives, in particularly the waves and waves and waves of dead children coming in. Like waves of dead children coming in. Probably doesn't help the fact you can tell from my accent that I'm Irish, and we tend to default to anger. We were known for it, so that didn't help. And I felt quite agitated at times. I was angry that I was having to deal with injuries in children that not in my wildest dreams did I think I would ever see. And then guilt on top of that, because I knew, being a white Caucasian Western male, that I had the power to leave. I had the elitism to leave, and they didn't. I never felt that they felt any conflict towards me. In fact, the driver who drove us out to the Gaza-Israeli border on the morning we were leaving, who was a UN driver, he was Palestinian, but he had a UN passport, so he had a diplomatic passport, but even he couldn't leave. His wife and kids had already exited and gone to Egypt. He'd managed to get them out. And his last words to me were, anyone left in Gaza now is either dead or is going to be dead. Quite chilling words. And he said it kind of tongue-in-cheek, but not. And I do remember feeling guilty, thinking, wow, he's so right. He is so right because they have no protection. They can't go anywhere. They can't hide. They can't fight back with the same level. That's why I say it's a conflict, not a war. Mm-hmm. And yes, you're right. Genocide is the proper term. So it's not even. It's not an even fight. And when you start bombing hospitals and healthcare facilities, then all bets are off, because it goes against all the ethics and all the morals that conflict has developed over the last number of centuries. But in particular, since World War II, everybody knows you don't bomb healthcare facilities, because healthcare facilities are by definition neutral and impartial. They have one goal, and that's to provide humanitarian assistance, whether you're Palestinian or Jewish. It doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter.
I'll say something about that, though, because this is, obviously that particular strike that you were in the hospital when it happened. Israel said that there was a Hamas commander there. Hamas said he was being treated, that he wasn't fighting. There were reports that he was visiting someone who was treated. But, regardless, right? So there are all these conflicting accounts of who was there and why and what they were doing. But it really comes down to, regardless of what it was the collateral damage worth it? The dozens of children that you were seeing, the dead bodies, the destruction of the hospital. One thing when I was watching that documentary, Doctors Under Attack, the thing that was running over and over again in my head is, this isn't just a target. This isn't just about a targeted attack. This is about, you really see it. It was a systematic, deliberate destruction of a healthcare infrastructure. Because when you watch the movie and when you see that, when they, how the Israeli military was going in and how they were razing things to the ground, how, machinery and medication, like everything was being destroyed, so that even, let's say they were going after a target. Let's say the target was eliminated. Let's say there was a lot of collateral damage. You also can never use that hospital again. Yeah. So that's not just, that's what struck me as different about this when I was watching it, is that it was an irreversible destruction of facilities that were meant to sustain human life. Yeah.
There's no ethics being held up to account for pretty much all of what Israel is doing in Gaza right now. If you hit a healthcare facility, it's different if the healthcare facility has made its intention to also be a military facility. So that didn't happen. That hasn't happened. It was, from what I was told, it was one person was in the hospital visiting. I don't know if it was a friend or a relative, but they completely destroyed an entire ward. They killed the person that they intended to kill, plus one other person. I'm amazed when you see the destruction of the war. I'm amazed more people weren't killed. Mm-hmm. But motive is irrelevant. And we're talking about one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. Was there a need to kill that person in a hospital? Secondly, it also goes against the laws, international laws and laws of war, to kill an unarmed person. Yeah. You can take them prisoner and then you hold them to account. You make it justiciable, so that that they would go through a court system and do it properly. But we're talking about the most sophisticated military in the world. That if they were outside this building, they could tell the color of our eyes, and yet they chose to target said person in a healthcare facility. It is against the laws of war. It is against international law. And it is more evidence of an act that will go towards evidence of genocide eventually.
I was watching a video of you talking to a little boy who was in a hospital bed, and you were giving him a high five. Yeah. Which I'm sure you also, despite everything that you were feeling and going through, that you had to put on a brave face for these kids. You don't want to scare them any more than they're already scared. But you looked at another doctor, a colleague of yours, and the first question you asked was, "Are his parents dead?" Yeah. And that just, it really sent chills down my body, because I was like, Is that the first question now? Are his parents dead? And it turned out that his parents weren't dead; they were injured, but that his siblings had
Siblings are
died.
dead. So people's lives have been destroyed. You know, it's one of the things that we were seeing a lot in Gaza. Wounded child, no surviving family. WC, NSF, and they'd often get labelled that. And there were many kids who would wake up after surgery with severe injuries, but they survived, and they would cry for their mothers, and their mothers are no longer there. I saw families where there's one surviving child, one was a baby, and the entire rest of the family were completely wiped out, and we couldn't trace any other family members. I don't know what's going to happen to that child. Other children with shrapnel injuries to their brain, paralysed down one side, limbs gone, spleens gone, chests open, children dying. Some children brought in makeshift buckets and pieces after been bombed. The thing about injured children is injured children are very quiet. Injured children don't cry. They're too. So it's quite chilling.
It's
when
like
you
a
see,
shock. Are they in shock?
If you walk into an emergency room, there's a child crying, you need to do something eventually, but that child's okay. You know straight away a child that's acting appropriately. When you see an injured child, severely injured child, they're quiet. They just lie there, and it can be quite chilling. And you have to move with more focus with them. That particular boy was the first boy that we operated on. He was brought in along with his dead siblings that night, and it was about 2 a.m, maybe 2:30. The explosions had gone off, and the emergency room was just overcrowded. We couldn't do anything there. I didn't trust the elevators in the hospital, so I picked him up and ran up 4 flights of stairs. And he was the first kid that we operated on, and he survived. He also had a torn artery at the back of his knee, repaired. Last I heard, he kept his legs, which I'm delighted about. But he's still in for a rough time. He had a lot of soft tissue injury, but he survived. Other children didn't. Other children weren't so lucky. And I remember distinctly working from about 3 a.m. until about 11 a.m. that morning solidly, literally going from one operating room to the next, to the next, to the next. Many of them were children. And then I wandered through the intensive care unit at about maybe midday to get a drink of water, and the entire intensive care unit was full, and everyone seemed okay. And I remember feeling quite proud, they've survived, they're here. And then I came back at about 6 that evening, and it was half empty because they died. So it does feel sometimes like you're bailing out the ocean with a bucket. You're doing your very best, but yet the injuries keep happening. They're too severe. The injuries are too severe for these children to survive, and many adults as well. And it just was wave after wave after wave. And there is nothing on planet Earth that can justify that level of violence towards any population.
So one of the narratives out there, of course, that's used to justify everything that we're seeing is that Hamas is running around everywhere, they're embedded in every hospital, they're hiding in schools, they're hiding in refugee camps. What was your experience with that? I mean, when you were at this hospital, did you see anything like that, or did you hear anything like that?
No, and I wouldn't. And when you're a humanitarian surgeon or doctor, and you go in, you're impartial, you're neutral, you're there for humanitarian reasons, and you have to be independent. I certainly wasn't involved in any conversations whatsoever. But what I would say is that it still doesn't justify the slaughter of innocent children and women and people. It just doesn't. Nothing justifies that. If you're so clever, if you have the evidence that there is a terrorist organization somewhere, then how come you can't go in and do it properly, have habeas corpus, have people go through a proper legal system? Instead, you go in and just kill indiscriminately and hope for the best. It's not a credible thing to say, and I also think it's probably lazy. It's a lazy thing to say that, they're everywhere, therefore we're justified in killing a whole population.
Yeah, I think that even if people do really appreciate and pay attention to the number of people killed and the number of women and children killed, I don't think, when I talk to people and when I talk to policymakers, that there is adequate appreciation for the fact that those who aren't killed, they are going to be dealing with lifelong trauma, lifelong injuries. Gaza now has the highest percentage of child amputees in the world. The most recent number I saw was 18,000 orphaned children. I mean, I actually wanted to ask you about that, whether you ever had to operate without anesthetics.
I didn't. thankfully. We had enough. The first time I was in Gaza, we ran out of certain types of anesthetics, but we were able to mix and match enough. Yeah. Second time around, because there was a ceasefire and then it was breached, they had gotten enough supplies in. But since I've left, I've been informed that people have had to operate without anesthesia.
And since you've left, obviously, the situation has gotten much worse. And you haven't been around. You left before the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called Humanitarian Foundation, came into Gaza. But your colleagues since then, including Dr. Victoria Rose, who I saw at the screening of the movie that I told you about, the documentary that I saw, she was talking about even different kinds of wounds, gunshot wounds in children. So it goes back to what you said, really. And I want to ask you about this because for anyone who might be listening to this, who's working in policy, former colleagues of mine, what message do you want to give to policymakers who may be supporting what is happening in Gaza, who may be supportive of the Israeli military, the Israeli government doing what it's doing in Gaza because they're saying that this is a war, or, well, Hamas must be eliminated, or, what do you have to say to them?
Well, first of all, you don't eliminate any group that you've labelled a terrorist organisation by wiping out the civilian population. We all know that, if anything, all you're going to do is make more civilians want to be part of a terrorist organisation because you make people angry. I think we're all responsible in Europe. I think we have turned a blind eye. I would ask policymakers why. Why are you genuinely supporting? And can you look yourself in the eye, in the mirror, and ask yourself that we're doing the right thing? I was very disappointed that the UK High Court recently said it was perfectly lawful to send military parts to Israel for use. And I would say, while it may be lawful, is it moral? So nobody can stand by and watch the civilian population go through what they're going through right now. It is cruel. It is the deliberate starvation of a population. What Gaza needs tonight, other than a ceasefire, is food and water. Yeah. Doesn't even need medicine tonight. It needs food and water. So we've got almost no healthcare facilities left. Nasser Hospital, I believe, is the last functioning hospital in Gaza, and last I heard it was at 40% capacity. There's no place safe. There's no actual dedicated humanitarian zone. It was well known when we were there that when the Israeli military put out a warning to move people from a humanitarian zone because they planned to bomb it, they bombed it before they put the actual warning out. So we were receiving casualties from certain areas, and then we hear about the warning to move. Wow. So it's just absolute torture of a population. And, nobody can ever look into the heart of anybody and say what your intention is. No criminal will ever say, I intended to go out and kill somebody, because that's murder. If you can say, I hadn't every intention, it's manslaughter, and you get a better, sentence. But we communicate in different ways, words and deeds, and the actions that have been going on over the last 18, 19, 20 months are such that the intention is clearly to be as cruel as possible and to wipe out a population of people.
One last question, Morgan. Do you think you're going to go back, or you're going to try to go back?
It's something I'd like to do. I certainly feel bonded by it. I feel I've more to give. I don't know if there will be anything to go back to, unfortunately, but yes, I would go back. I would like us to reach out to our politicians to say, regardless of who you think is right, this isn't about right or wrong anymore. It's about doing the right thing. It's about responsibility, and it's about the truth. And healthcare workers now have moved from being healthcare workers to advocating for the truth, because there's no journalists in there to gather the evidence who are much better at it. Journalists are much better at gathering the evidence to say, this is what's happening. That's not been allowed to happen. So you have to ask yourself, why? And there's always a special place in human rights to allow journalists to go in and gather information that's well recognised.
But I also think that's why, your role and you speaking out and you doing this interview with me and you talking about your experience is so important, because they're not letting international journalists in. And a lot of people, I think, don't believe what's happening because it boggles the mind. I mean, it's impossible to believe. And so so this is the thing. So it's one of two things. So the Israeli government will say, this journalist was Hamas or that person was Hamas. And I think people will either believe that because there's this absolute strain of racism and dehumanization against Arabs, against Palestinians. And so they might actually believe that, or they might just want to believe that.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There's the dehumanization, and it's easy. It's easy to dehumanize a population because they're not white Caucasian. Right. It's so easy. We see it in movies all the time, and anyone who goes in and also, like, if you look at any conflict, it's very important that you dehumanize the population so that you can carry out your intentions and not feel internally, but you're also dehumanizing yourself by doing it. So both populations, the aggressor and the aggressee, are both dehumanized. And
that foreshadows a very dark turn in human history when we get to the point. We've read about things like this before, and we've asked ourselves how this was allowed to happen. And now you're watching it in real time and just having to ask yourself how people are okay with this. How is this happening? Not how did this happen in the past? Yeah. How did we not learn the lessons? How is this happening again? And it almost is, for me, just speaking for myself, and I know for a lot of other people that I've spoken to, it's really difficult to process. You almost walk around in a haze, like you're removed from the world somehow, because you can't actually quite process how this is happening. So I can't even imagine for you, having been there, having seen it, having tried to save as many people as you could over there, and then coming back here and people are going about their daily lives.
It shouldn't be that difficult. One of the best things that ever come out of England is the common law, because the common law is based on reasonability and proportionality. And to go back to what would you say to policymakers and politicians, look at the situation, look at it in its holistic sense and ask yourself, is it reasonable or proportionate what's going on in Gaza? And if the answer is no, you have a responsibility to stand up and say, stop. You can have a ceasefire and then you can look at the evidence. But unfortunately, I do feel that the aggressor is so far gone now down that path, they don't want the evidence to come out. As a collective, we in Europe have not been strong at standing up and doing the right thing and saying the right thing at the right time. In fact, even the European Convention on Human Rights, which is very strongly based on a lot of UK common law, and the UK was very instrumental in creating that charter, as it was with the Rome Statute of 1998 against genocide. Just look at it and ask, is it reasonable and is it proportionate what's happening? And if the answer is no, then it has to be stopped.
Well, Morgan, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing your story. I really, really appreciate it. And I know our listeners will too. So thank you. I hope you found that conversation as eye-opening as I did. When I asked Morgan at the end if he was going to go back to Gaza or if he wanted to, he said he would like to, but he doesn't know if he'll be allowed back given the fact that he's been speaking out about his experiences. He also said he doesn't know if there's going to be anything to go back to. We will definitely stay in touch with him, and we'll have him back on the show if he does end up going back. If you liked what you heard and you want to hear more conversations like this, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to us on our YouTube, leave a review, and you can also always email us at viewfromherepod@gmail.com. That's viewfromherepod@gmail.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine El-Gamal, and this is The View From Here.